Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
When the pantograph is removed from the mouth, we want to continually check to make sure that we are keeping the centric points. We can continually check by placing the stylus down against the tables as we have here and make sure that we've maintained our centric points on all 6 tables. You can, if you want, take the upper and lower members of the pantograph apart at this time, but I prefer to leave the wax wells the way they are, and I've luted the clutches together with some compound or some sticky wax. Lute the clutches together to make sure that the upper members and lower members of the pantograph stay together, and mount them on the articulator the way they are, and then separate it later to put on our clear acetates. The first thing we do then in the transfer of this to the articulator is to measure the intercondylar distance to give us a rough intercondylar distance for mounting this on the articulator. The first thing we do is to screw the posterior reference pins in all the way. These pins, the posterior reference pins, screw in all the way because we want to record the distance between the skin on either side of the head. And then we have a telescopic intercondylar distance measurer that fits between those 2 points, and it has a scale on here. So with that between the 2 points, we read on the scale, and it comes out somewhere around 53 units. Now we take this and put that 53 into the back of the articulator. We adjust the intercondylar distance now on the articulator to 53, and we put 53 on either side of the articulator. So we adjust the condyles. We move the condyle ball to where we read 53, as you see here. And we do the same thing on the opposite side. And 53. This gives us a rough intercondylar distance from which to start the setting of the articulator and from which to mount the pantograph on the articulator. Now we place in the articulator, to make it a mounting jig, we place our posterior reference pins, or these mounting studs, and these go in the little holes that you have here in the condyle ball. The lateral side of the condyle ball here, we have a hole, and we place our mounting studs in that hole, and we have a little hole in the mounting stud from which we will put the pantograph. You put one of those on each side of the articulator, and we have our 2 posterior mounting studs. Then you can loosen one side of your posterior reference pins on the articulator, and you can slip these posterior reference pins into the mounting studs on the articulator. And the articulator becomes the mounting jig for our pantograph. And then the anterior reference pin should rest on the table. Now I've placed on here a set of mounting plasterless mounts that needs to go down. You can see here the problem we have with this anterior reference pin. The horseshoe or the crank shape of it is to come out around the incisal table, and that rests on the tabletop, and that provides our anterior reference point. So the pantograph now is oriented to the articulator, and the lower member of the articulator becomes a mounting jig. We need to adjust the intercondylar distance of the upper member of the articulator to match the lower, and we do this by loosening the screws on the underside of the articulator, which controls the intercondylar distance, and we slide this end so that it is narrower than the intercondylar distance on the lower member of the articulator. You place this on the lower member of the articulator. You go ahead, lock your centric latch, and then just slide these condyles out until they touch the condyle balls. And then you can tighten the intercondylar distance screws. And this way you've oriented the maxillary member of the articulator quickly to the mandibular. We're now ready to go ahead and mount the pantograph to the articulator, and we do this with what we call a plasterless mount. You see here that we have a plasterless mount that comes from the maxillary member of the articulator down in the vicinity of the clutches. Now what you want to do is to adjust the height of this plate so that it just barely touches or just barely clears the maxillary clutch. There is a screw adjustment on the bar that holds that plate. We loosen that, let that drop down, and tighten it up again, so that the plates for this are very close to the clutch. And you see here we have two large screws in that plate. Have those screws just barely coming through to where there's a little bit of the thread showing. And you would do the same thing with the mandibular. You would raise and lower the mandibular frame. There is a screw in the back of the and you raise and lower that until it just touches the mandibular clutch, and we tighten this in position. So you can see here now that we have the pantograph oriented to the plasterless mounts. Now what we will do is to go ahead, mix up a mix of our quick cure acrylics, the fast tray, the same material that we use to make our clutches. We mix up a mix of this and attach the upper and lower clutch to the plasterless mount. And this can be done attaching both of them at the same time. Put a portion of it on the maxillary clutch. The incisal pin on the articulator should be set at 0 at this point to maintain that position. We need to put some on the lower first, so we'll get rid of that upper member. Lift that up, put a blob of the material on the lower mount, and close that to where the clutch is touching that. With the pantograph mounted to the articulator, we have preserved the relationship between the upper and lower members of the pantograph. It is important at this stage, though, to make sure that your condyles were seated firmly against the fosses when you mounted the clutches on the articulator, and that the incisal pin touches the table and is set at 0. If not, you'll lose your centric pins when you go on to the next step. Now we can go ahead and separate the upper and lower members of the articulator and the pantograph. We can loosen the screws on the centric stop sleeves, and we can take the centric stops up out of the wax wells. We can take the luting material that we use to lute the clutches together, take those off, and we can open the articulator and take the upper member of the articulator off, leaving the lower member of the clutch attached to the articulator. Now we have protective overlays. During the setting of the articulator, we will make a number of movements over these tracings that we've taken, and we need to protect these. So we can protect these with a set of plastic overlays that come pre-cut from the manufacturer, and they fit over the tracing. And we can go ahead now and put the stylus against that tracing and make our movements. Now on this tracing you can see the number of movements or different tracings that the patient had. But this is of no consequence really. What we want is the most lateral or the most border position. Any position within that line or those lines is insignificant. So what we would use in setting the articulator is to set to the most lateral movement. Now we can go ahead and put the rest of the overlays on the tracings. We need to remove some of the mounting parts now. This can be removed from the holder. And then we want to remove our posterior reference pins. You do that by loosening the screw. Now support those because you don't want to distort or torque these arms. We want them to remain in the exact position. The disappointing thing is to go ahead and mount the pantograph on the articulator and then find out you've lost your centric points. But we can remove these and then remove our posterior, our mounting studs. Once you have those removed, we can go ahead now and move the articulator and go through the settings of the articulator. You want to make sure that you have none of the acrylic that you use to mount this on the articulator. Make sure that the acrylic that you use to mount it to the plasterless mounts has not prevented the movement of the clutch. So now we could move this articulator and the pantograph in relationship to the tracings, and we could now go ahead and set the articulator from this pantographic survey.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.